In the scorched heart of the Arizona Territory, where the sun stripped mercy from the land, a stepfather bartered his 18-year-old daughter to Apache warriors as though she were livestock. A calculated cruelty disguised as desperation. Abner Vance stood in the doorway of the crumbling adobe ranch house, watching the dust cloud of the Chiricahua band fade into the Sierra, and his mouth twisted into something that resembled satisfaction more than grief. The girl he had handed over, Ishkay, possessed the one thing that stood between him and total ownership of the vast grazing lands her father had died protecting. A legal claim written in territorial law. In Abner's cold arithmetic, a missing stepdaughter consumed by the wilderness was far more convenient than a living heir. The ranch had become a mausoleum long before that morning. After her father's burial, Ishkay found herself transformed from daughter to ghost, invisible, except when Abner needed someone to blame for burnt meals or dusty floors. The man who had courted her mother with honey words revealed himself as something calcified and cruel. A prospector who had married not for love, but for mineral rights to another man's dream. He rationed her food, locked her in the root cellar for imagined infractions, and spoke of her in the third person, even when she stood in the same room, as though her presence barely registered as human. The bruises on her arms told stories she never voiced, and the silence in the house grew so thick it seemed to have weight. Abner's opportunity arrived with the drums. Apache raiding parties had been pushing back against the encroaching settlements, and when a Chiricahua band approached the ranch demanding tribute, Abner saw not danger but deliverance. He offered them his stepdaughter with theatrical reluctance, wringing his hands and speaking of sacrifice, while his eyes gleamed with anticipation. The warriors accepted, and Ishkay was bound and placed on a spare horse, her few possessions crammed into a worn travel bag. As they rode away, she looked back once at the ranch that had been her prison, and felt something unexpected stir in her chest, not fear of what lay ahead, but a strange, wild relief at what she was leaving behind. The journey into the Dragoon Mountains stripped away every assumption Ishkay had carried about savagery and civilization. The Chiricahua moved through the terrain like water finding its course, reading the land in a language she had never learned. At night, they made camps that left almost no trace, their fires small and smokeless, their voices low and purposeful. Ishkay was given a bedroll and left alone, neither welcomed nor threatened, simply observed. The women watched her with eyes that assessed rather than judged, noting how she held herself, how she moved, whether she complained or adapted. One evening, an elder passed her a piece of dried meat without comment, a small gesture that felt heavier than any speech. The leader of the band was a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Goyathle Ka carried himself with the economy of someone who had survived by reading the smallest shifts in wind and shadow. His face bore the map of hard years, and his eyes held a quality that reminded Ishkay of obsidian, beautiful and cutting. He spoke to her only once in those early days, his English rough but precise, telling her that the desert did not forgive weakness, and neither would he. Then he turned away, leaving her to interpret what survival might require. That night, alone with the immensity of the star-scattered sky, Ishkay understood she had been given not a sentence but a challenge. What Abner had not anticipated, in his smug certainty of her demise, was that Ishkay possessed her father's stubbornness and her own sharp intelligence. She watched everything. She learned to identify the plants that held water in their roots, to read the flight patterns of birds that signaled distant storms, to move through brush without snagging fabric or skin. When the band's horses showed signs of saddle sores, she offered to help, using techniques her father had taught her, working leather with careful hands until even the most skeptical warrior had to acknowledge her skill. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic shifted. She was no longer cargo to be tolerated, but a resource to be utilized. The first real test came when a trader arrived at one of the neutral meeting grounds, where Apaches and settlers exchanged goods under an uneasy truce. The man brought sacks of flour and cornmeal, his prices fair, his manner friendly. But Ishkay, who had learned to read, noticed something in the faded lettering on the sacks, a mill mark from a company she knew had been shut down for contaminating grain with rat poison. She approached Goyathle Ka and spoke quickly, explaining what she had seen. The warrior studied her face for a long moment, then walked to the trader and drove him away with words sharp as rifle shots. That evening, Goyathle Ka sat across the fire from Ishke-Ne and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt like a door opening. But even as Ishke-Ne proved her worth, a shadow lingered in her travel bag, hidden in the lining of her old dress, a document she had not known existed, placed there by a servant loyal to her father's memory, waiting like a seed for the right season to sprout. The Kirikahwa stronghold was not a single place, but a constellation of camps that shifted with the seasons and the movements of the cavalry. Ishke-Ne learned to read the rhythm of this nomadic existence, the careful balance between vigilance and rest, the way supplies were cached in hidden locations, the protocols of sharing that ensured no one starved while others feasted. The women taught her to weave baskets so tight they could hold water, to prepare food that could last weeks without spoiling, to tend injuries with plants that drew out infection. The children watched her with curiosity rather than fear, and gradually they began to include her in their games, testing whether this pale stranger could keep up. Goyathle Ka remained a figure of authority and distance, but Ishke-Ne noticed the small ways he watched over his people. He settled disputes with a combination of wisdom and firmness, never raising his voice but commanding absolute attention. He listened to the elders with genuine respect, and he trained the younger warriors with a patience that surprised her. There was a code here, she realized, as rigid and honored as any law she had known, but built on principles of survival, loyalty, and mutual protection rather than property and profit. The Chiricahua did not take more than they needed, did not waste what they killed, did not abandon their vulnerable. It stood in stark contrast to the world that had produced Abner Vance. One afternoon, as Ishke-Ne worked on repairing a torn saddle blanket, a young warrior approached with barely concealed hostility. He spoke in Apache, his tone making his meaning clear, even though she could not understand the words. An elder woman translated with evident reluctance. The warrior questioned why a white woman should share their camps when her people killed Apache children and burned their homes. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Ishke-Ne set down her work and met his eyes directly, not with defiance but with something quieter and more powerful. She spoke of her own displacement, of being unwanted in the world she had been born into, of understanding what it meant to be seen as less than human. The young warrior listened, his expression unreadable, then walked away. But that evening, he returned and placed a pair of worn but serviceable moccasins beside her bedroll, an offering that required no translation. The seasons shifted. Ishke-Ne's skin darkened under the relentless sun, and her hands grew calloused from work. She learned to move quietly, to make herself useful without being intrusive, to contribute to the collective survival that defined Apache life. And in the quiet moments, when the camp settled into evening rhythms, she sometimes found herself near Goyathle Ka, both of them staring into flames or out at the vast landscape. They did not speak often, but in those silences something profound developed, a recognition of shared experience that transcended language. He had lost his family to betrayal by soldiers who came under a white flag. She had lost hers to betrayal by a man who should have protected her. They were both exiles in different ways, and that common ground became sacred. What Ishke-Ne did not yet know was that her absence had not freed Abner Vance but trapped him. Without a body, without proof of death, the legal questions about land ownership remained unresolved. Lawyers in Tucson were asking uncomfortable questions, and territorial officials were beginning to investigate why a young woman had disappeared so conveniently. Abner needed a narrative that would close the case permanently, and he was willing to manufacture whatever evidence that required. In his calculations, dead Apaches and a tragic tale of massacre would serve his purposes perfectly, and he began making arrangements with certain elements of the cavalry who saw Apache campaigns as opportunities for plunder and promotion. The first sign of danger came from an unexpected direction. Goyathle Ka's scouts reported unusual activity. soldiers moving in patterns that suggested coordination with civilian guides, questions being asked in trading posts about a white woman among the Chiricahua, and an unsettling increase in the number of unofficial militias forming in the settlements. The warrior leader recognized the shape of a trap being constructed, and he knew that Ishkay-ne, whether she understood it or not, was the bait meant to draw his people into a killing ground. The crisis arrived on a morning when the high desert air carried the scent of distant rain. A child, exploring too far from camp, disturbed a rattlesnake nest and was bitten multiple times. The venom worked quickly, and within minutes the boy was convulsing, his small body racked with tremors. The camp's healer worked with desperate speed, cutting the wounds and applying poultices, but the amount of venom was overwhelming. The child's mother held him and keened, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Every second that passed brought the boy closer to death, and the healer's face showed the terrible knowledge that her skills might not be enough. Ishkay-ne had been gathering firewood when the commotion erupted. She ran toward the sound and saw the situation in an instant. Her father, in his years of ranching, had dealt with rattlesnake bites in cattle and horses, and he had taught her a technique learned from Mexican vaqueros, a specific combination of cutting, suction, and herbal treatment that could neutralize venom if applied with precision and speed. She did not ask permission. She dropped beside the healer and began working, her hands steady even as her heart hammered. She created deeper incisions than the healer had dared, drawing out the venom with carefully controlled suction, then packed the wounds with a mixture of crushed yarrow and sage that she had seen used before. The process was brutal, and the boy screamed, but Ishkay-ne did not stop. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that hesitation meant death. Minutes stretched into an eternity measured in heartbeats and breath. The convulsions began to ease. The boy's color, which had turned grayish and terrible, started to return to something approaching normal. The healer watched Ishkay-ne's technique with sharp attention, then began to assist, adding her own knowledge to support the treatment. Together they fought for the child's life, and slowly, agonizingly, they won. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the boy was breathing steadily. The worst of the crisis passed. His mother touched Ishkay-ne's face, tears streaming, speaking words that needed no translation. But the victory contained a revelation that changed everything. While treating the child, Ishkay-ne had been in the healer's shelter, a wickiup that contained the tribe's most sacred medicines and objects. There, partially hidden behind bundles of dried herbs, she glimpsed something that sent shock through her system. A cavalry jacket, relatively new, bearing insignia that she recognized from visits to Fort Bowie. It was not the jacket itself that disturbed her, but what it represented. Apaches did not typically keep such trophies unless they held significance. Later, when the camp had settled and the child was sleeping peacefully, Ishkay-ne carefully asked one of the women who spoke English about the jacket. The woman's face hardened, and she told a story of betrayal. The jacket had belonged to an officer who had promised safe conduct to Apache families seeking peace, then opened fire on them when they arrived unarmed at the meeting place. Goyathle-Ka had tracked that officer for 3 months and executed him personally. The jacket was kept as a reminder that white promises often came wrapped in blood. The story resonated through Ishkay-ne's understanding of her own situation. Abner Vance had made promises too, to her mother on her deathbed, to the community, to territorial officials. And every promise had been a calculated lie. She began to wonder what other lies were being told. What other betrayals were being planned? That night, as the stars wheeled overhead and the camp slept, Goyathle-Ka approached her. He spoke quietly, his English careful. He told her that saving the child had earned her something precious among his people, trust. But he also warned her that her presence was drawing dangerous attention, that there were forces moving in the territory that wanted her dead or wanted to use her death as justification for massacre. He asked her a question that echoed into the darkness. Did she know why Abner Vance wanted her gone badly enough to risk everything? Ishkay-ne had no answer, but the question burrowed into her mind like a seed seeking soil. In the weeks that followed the child's recovery, Something shifted in the fabric of camp life. The women sought Ishkay-Nay's company more openly, teaching her their language with patient repetition, laughing at her mispronunciations but encouraging her efforts. The children no longer treated her as a curiosity, but as an auntie-figure, bringing her treasures they found, interesting rocks, bird feathers, wildflowers that somehow survived in the harsh terrain. She learned to cook Apache style, to preserve meat by drying it in thin strips over mesquite smoke, to make a nutritious mush from mesquite beans that sustained them during lean times. Her hands, once soft and suited only for needlework, became capable of 100 practical tasks. Goyathle-Ka began including her in evening councils, not as a participant but as a silent witness. She listened as the warriors discussed movements of cavalry units, debated whether certain water sources were safe, planned raids for horses and supplies. She came to understand the strategic brilliance behind their survival. They fought not to conquer, but to maintain freedom, to protect the sacred places of their ancestors, to ensure their children would know the old ways. Every raid was calculated, every confrontation chosen with care. They were not the mindless savages that newspapers described, but tacticians fighting a war of survival against overwhelming odds. In quiet moments, usually at dawn or dusk when the camp was between the industry of day and the rest of night, Ishkay-Nay and Goyathle-Ka began to share pieces of their stories. He spoke of his wife and children, killed in a massacre when soldiers attacked during a peace negotiation. He described the sound of his daughter's laughter, now silent forever. He told her of his clan's traditional lands, places where springs ran pure and game was plentiful, all of it taken by treaties that were broken before the ink dried. His voice carried a weight that was beyond bitterness, a grief that had transformed into adamantine resolve. He would not surrender. He would not let his people be herded onto reservations to starve slowly, while corrupt Indian agents sold their rations for profit. He would die free in the mountains rather than live as a beggar in the dust. Ishkay-Nay shared her own ghosts. She spoke of her father, a man who had treated everyone with dignity regardless of their background, who had believed in building something lasting and good in the harsh territory. She described how his death had left her vulnerable to Abner's manipulation, how her mother's illness and death had removed the last barrier of protection. She confessed the depth of her stepfather's cruelty, the systematic way he had tried to erase her humanity. And she admitted something she had barely acknowledged to herself, that among the Chiricahua she had found something she had never had in the white world. She had found respect earned through deeds rather than granted through birth. She had found purpose in contributing to collective survival. She had found, against all logic and expectation, a kind of home. The bond between them deepened in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. They were kindred spirits, both displaced, both fighting to maintain dignity in a world that tried to strip it away. When Goyathle-Ka taught her to shoot his rifle with precision, it was an act of profound trust in a culture where weapons were sacred. When she shared with him the written words of territorial newspapers, translating the lies and half-truths that shaped public opinion about Apache resistance, she gave him intelligence that could save lives. They became partners in a dance of survival, each bringing skills the other lacked, creating something stronger than either could be alone. But predators were circling, and the peace they had built was as fragile as spring ice. The trap that Abner Vance was constructing, with help from ambitious military officers and ruthless civilian opportunists, was about to spring. The messenger arrived at a neutral trading post on a Tuesday, riding a well-fed horse and wearing clothes too clean for honest travel. His name was Jedediah Miller, and he carried himself with the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. He spread word that he sought the Chiricahua band, that he came with a message of reconciliation from Abner Vance, that the rancher deeply regretted his hasty decision and wished to negotiate his stepdaughter's return with generous compensation. The story was calculated to appeal to Apache pragmatism. Horses, rifles, ammunition, and blankets in exchange for a white woman who surely wanted to return to her own people. The message reached Goyathle-Ka through the network of scouts and informants that kept the Chiricahua, one step ahead of their enemies. The warrior leader's instincts screamed warning. He had survived decades of treachery by trusting those instincts, by reading the small signs that others missed. He studied the reports carefully. Miller's horse was too healthy for a man who claimed to have ridden hard from the Vance ranch. The man's hands showed no calluses, suggesting he was no working cowhand. His eyes moved constantly, the behavior of someone scouting rather than negotiating. And most damning, he had been seen in conversation with a cavalry lieutenant known for his enthusiasm in Apache campaigns. A man who measured success by body counts and saw Indians as obstacles to be cleared, rather than humans to be understood. Goyath-le-Ka shared his suspicions with Ishkay-Ne, laying out the evidence with characteristic directness. Abner did not want her back. Abner wanted her dead, but in a way that would justify a military response. If she returned to him, she would disappear permanently, probably killed, and her death blamed on Apache raiders. If she stayed with the Chiricahua and her presence became known, the cavalry would use it as justification for a major offensive against the band. Either way, Abner got what he wanted. The girl eliminated and his legal claim to the ranch secured. It was an elegant trap, and it was already closing. The revelation hit Ishkay-Ne like physical force. She had known Abner was cruel, but this level of calculated murder was beyond what she had imagined. She thought of the people around her, the children who played in the camp, the elders who kept the stories alive, the warriors who fought to protect their families. All of them were now in danger because of her existence, because of land and law and greed that had nothing to do with justice. The guilt was crushing, but beneath it, something harder began to form. If Abner wanted her dead, he wanted it for a reason. There was power in her existence that she had not understood. That night, unable to sleep, Ishkay-Ne went through her possessions, the pitiful collection of items that had survived her various upheavals. She examined her old dress, the one she had worn when Abner handed her over to the Chiricahua. She had not worn it in months, but something made her look at it more carefully now. The hem was heavier than it should be. With trembling fingers, she unpicked the stitching and found, hidden in the lining, a folded document wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands shook as she opened it. By firelight, she read the title and deed to the Vance Ranch, made out not in her father's name and certainly not in Abner's, but in her own name, executed 2 days before her father's death. A note in familiar handwriting, from the ranch's foreman who had disappeared shortly after the funeral, explained everything. Her father had known he was dying, had suspected Abner's true character, and had legally transferred the property to his daughter before death could complicate inheritance. Abner's marriage to her mother gave him no legal claim whatsoever. He was a tenant on land that belonged to Ishkay-Ne. The implications cascaded through her understanding like dominoes falling. Every cruelty, every abuse, every threat had been designed to make her disappear or become too broken to assert her rights. The trade to the Apaches was not random violence, but calculated murder, a way to eliminate her while maintaining deniability. Abner had been living in terror of this document surfacing, and now it had. The power in her hands, this piece of paper that represented thousands of acres of prime grazing land, was enough to destroy him completely. But claiming that power meant walking back into the world that had tried to kill her, meant trusting in laws and systems that had already failed her once, meant risking not just her own life, but the lives of the Chiricahua who had sheltered her. Ishkay-Ne showed the deed to Goyath-le-Ka, explaining its significance with growing excitement. He listened carefully, his face unreadable, then asked a question that cut to the heart of everything. What did she want to do? Not what she should do, not what was expected, but what she truly wanted. The choice was hers, and whatever she decided, he would support. In that moment, Ishkay-Ne understood that the Chiricahua offered her something the white world never had: genuine agency, the right to determine her own path without manipulation or coercion. The deed was a weapon, but how to wield it required careful thought. Abner had power, connections, and the presumption of civilization on his side, but Ishkay-Ne had truth, and she had something else equally valuable. She had allies who understood how to fight against overwhelming odds. The plan took shape over several days of intense discussion. Simply presenting the deed to territorial authorities would not be enough. Abner would claim forgery, would produce witnesses to lie on his behalf, would use every connection he had to discredit a young woman who had been living with Apaches. The appearance of impropriety alone would undermine her case. What they needed was not just legal evidence, but a spectacle, something so dramatic and public that Abner could not control the narrative. They needed to turn his trap against him, to force a confrontation in a setting where lies would collapse under their own weight. Goyathle Ka proposed something audacious. He would escort Ishkay directly to the territorial judge's office in Ojo Caliente during the monthly court session, when the town would be full of witnesses and the judge would be conducting public business. The appearance of a feared Apache war leader walking calmly into a settlement would create such shock and confusion that Abner would have no time to prepare his defense. More importantly, it would make clear that Ishkay was not a rescued captive, but a woman making her own choices, supported by allies who had every reason to kill her, but instead protected her. The visual contradiction would undermine every assumption about savage Apaches and helpless white maidens. The risks were enormous. Goyathle Ka and anyone accompanying him would be walking into a place where they could easily be shot on sight. Ishkay would be exposing herself to potential kidnapping or murder before reaching the judge. But the warrior leader pointed out that the greatest risk was doing nothing. Jedediah Miller's message had already put the cavalry on alert. Apache scouts reported increased patrols and the movement of troops toward Chiricahua territory. The attack was coming regardless. At least this way, they controlled the timing and the setting. At least this way, there was a chance to strike at the root cause rather than just defending against symptoms. Preparations began with meticulous care. A delegation was chosen. Goyathle Ka, 3 trusted warriors, 2 elder women who commanded respect, and Ishkay. They would go armed but with weapons concealed, a show of confidence rather than aggression. They would time their arrival for mid-morning on court day, when the town would be busy but not yet deep into the day's business. Scouts would move ahead to watch for ambushes and report any unusual military activity. If the situation deteriorated, the delegation had escape routes planned through terrain where cavalry horses could not easily follow. They were prepared to fight if necessary, but the primary objective was to reach the judge and present the truth in a forum where it could not be easily suppressed. The night before departure, the camp held a small ceremony. The people who had become Ishkay's family offered blessings and protections according to their traditions. The healer painted symbols on her face that signified truth speaker and protected one. The warriors sharpened weapons and checked their ammunition with the calm focus of men who understood they might not return. The children were kept ignorant of the danger, but they sensed something significant was happening, and they were unusually quiet. Goyathle Ka spoke to his people, reminding them that the fight they waged was not about territory or revenge, but about the right to exist with dignity, to determine their own fate, to protect those who could not protect themselves. Ishkay was risking everything to fight for justice, and in doing so, she embodied the values they held sacred. Ishkay herself felt a curious calm descend. For months, she had been reactive, adapting to circumstances thrust upon her. Now, for the first time since her father's death, she was taking action, seizing control of her own narrative. The fear was present, sharp and real, but it was overshadowed by something fiercer. Abner Vance had tried to erase her. He had tried to make her disappear into the desert, to become just another tragic story whispered in settlement taverns. Instead, she had survived, had grown stronger, had found her voice. Tomorrow she would speak, and her words would have the weight of law behind them. She sat beside Goyathle Ka and watched the stars wheel overhead. And they did not need words to communicate the depth of their bond. Whatever came, they would face it as equals, as warriors in their own right, as 2 people who had found in each other a reflection of their own unbreakable will. Dawn came with a sky painted in shades of fire and gold, and the small delegation rode toward a confrontation that would reshape everything. Ojo Caliente on court day was a chaos of commerce and complaint. Ranchers argued over water rights, merchants settled accounts, and lawyers circled like buzzards looking for fees. The territorial judge, Solomon Wright, was a hard man weathered by years of trying to impose order on a landscape that resisted structure. His court was held in a converted trading post, and it served as the closest thing to civilization's authority in a region where power often came from the barrel of a gun. When word spread through the town that Apaches were approaching, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Shutters slammed closed, women grabbed children off the streets, men reached for rifles and formed defensive positions behind water troughs and wagon wheels. But the expected attack never came. Instead, the small delegation rode calmly down the main street, their posture neither aggressive nor submissive, simply present. Goyathle Ka led, his bearing that of a man who commanded mountains and had no fear of wooden buildings. Ishke Ne rode beside him, dressed in a combination of Apache and settler clothing that itself told a story. Neither fully one world nor the other. The crowd that gathered was silent, stunned by the sheer audacity of the moment. Apache warriors did not walk into settlements in broad daylight. White women who had been with Apaches did not return riding as equals alongside their captors. Nothing about this matched the expected patterns, and that uncertainty created a space where action froze. Judge Wright emerged from his makeshift courtroom, one hand on his sidearm, his expression caught between outrage and curiosity. Goyathle Ka addressed him in English, his words carefully chosen. He came under a flag of truce to present a matter of territorial law. He demanded safe conduct for the presentation of evidence in a case of fraud and attempted murder. He invoked the judge's own authority, suggesting that if Wright was truly a man of law, he would hear what they had to say before deciding whether to reach for his weapon. The challenge was brilliant in its simplicity. It forced Wright to either act as a judge or reveal himself as merely another violent settler. Wright was many things, but he was proud of his judicial role. He ordered the crowd to hold their fire and gestured for the delegation to approach. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating with tension. Armed men lined the walls, and every eye was on the Apaches with a mixture of hatred and fear. Ishke Ne stood before the judge, and when she spoke, her voice carried the clarity of someone who had survived too much to be intimidated by glares and whispers. She identified herself by her legal name, stated her claim to the Vance Ranch, and produced the deed. She described, in spare and devastating detail, the sequence of betrayals that had led to her being traded to the Chiricahua. She explained how Abner had attempted to engineer her death to steal her inheritance, and she revealed the existence of Jedediah Miller's false negotiations, which were designed to lure her to her death or to justify a military massacre of the people who had protected her. The courtroom erupted. Abner Vance, who had been present for other business, lunged forward with denials already forming on his lips, but his performance crumbled under scrutiny. Judge Wright, whatever his personal feelings about Apaches, was a legal mind trained to spot inconsistencies. He demanded to examine the deed, brought in a notary who confirmed its authenticity, and began asking Abner pointed questions about why he had never reported the deed's existence to the court, handling estate matters. Abner's lies tangled into knots. He claimed the deed was forged, then admitted he had known about it, but thought it invalid. Then tried to suggest Ishke Ne had been coerced by the Apaches into presenting it. Each contradiction weakened his position. Then Goyathle Ka spoke, and his testimony carried the weight of lived truth. He explained that he had accepted the girl as payment because refusal would have meant death for his scouts who were trapped near the ranch. He described her adaptation to Chiricahua life, her contributions, her freedom within the band. He asked with devastating simplicity why a man who claimed to care about his stepdaughter's return had sent a messenger who was seen conspiring with cavalry officers. He produced a piece of Miller's correspondence that his scouts had obtained, proving coordination between Abner and military forces planning an attack. The evidence was fragmentary, but sufficient to establish a pattern of deception. Judge Wright called for a recess, and spent an hour examining documents and conferring with what passed for legal counsel in the territory. When he returned, his verdict was delivered with the finality of iron striking iron. The deed was valid. Ishkay was the legal owner of the ranch and all its assets. Abner Vance was to be arrested pending investigation into fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. The messenger, Jedediah Miller, was to be apprehended for questioning. And most remarkably, Judge Wright ordered that Goyath Ka and his delegation be given safe conduct to leave the settlement, acknowledging that they had acted within the bounds of law by bringing the matter to court rather than settling it through violence. Abner's collapse was complete and ugly. He screamed about savage sympathizers and corrupt judges, about how a white man's word should count for more than Apache lies. He invoked God and civilization and racial destiny, all the comfortable lies that had allowed men like him to justify cruelty. But his words fell into silence. The people of Ojo Caliente, whatever their feelings about Indians, understood the basics of law and property. A man who would defraud his own stepdaughter and conspire with military forces for personal gain was a threat to all of them. The social contract that held frontier society together, fragile as it was, required that certain lines not be crossed. Abner had crossed them, and now he would pay the price. In the weeks that followed the courtroom confrontation, the Arizona Territory buzzed with the story. Newspapers from Tucson to Santa Fe carried accounts, each one more embroidered than the last. Some painted Ishkay as a captive who had been brainwashed by her Apache captors. Others portrayed her as a calculating woman who had manipulated savage warriors to regain her inheritance. A very few, came close to the truth. She was a survivor who had found unexpected allies and had used both law and courage to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The story became a mirror in which people saw what they wanted to see, confirming their existing beliefs about Indians and settlers and the nature of civilization. Ishkay paid little attention to the newspaper narratives. She was too busy with the practical reality of what she had won. The ranch required decisions. Abner had let it deteriorate through neglect, and by selling off livestock at bargain prices to pocket the cash. Fences needed mending. Buildings required repair, and debts needed settling. She could have stayed, could have hired hands and become a proper rancher, fulfilling the vision her father had held. For about 3 days, she tried. She walked through the rooms of the adobe house and felt the walls closing in. She looked at the horizon limited by fence lines and property markers and felt suffocated. The desert had taught her to breathe differently, to see distance not as emptiness but as possibility. The answer came to her in the quiet hours before dawn. She would keep the legal ownership of the land because it represented her father's legacy and because it gave her power to protect it from exploitation. But she would not live there. Instead, she would lease parcels to families who needed land to build honest lives, people who would treat the soil with respect and the water with reverence. The income would sustain the ranch's maintenance and provide resources she could use to help others. She met with Judge Wright and established a legal trust that would manage the property according to these principles, with a portion of any profits going to support a school that would educate children of all backgrounds, settler and Apache alike, if any chose to attend. The legal arrangements complete, Ishkay prepared to leave Ojo Caliente for the last time. The townspeople watched with mixed reactions. Some thought her mad to return to Apache territory. Some whispered that she had been ruined and could never fit into civilized society again. A quiet few, understood that she was making a choice that transcended their ability to judge. She was choosing freedom over security, chosen family over blood ties, a life of purpose over a life of propriety. Goyath Ka waited at the edge of town with the same small delegation that had brought her. When Ishkay rode toward them, she was dressed practically for desert travel, her possessions reduced to what could fit in saddlebags. The warriors nodded to her with the respect given to one who had proven themselves in the ways that mattered to them. The elder women smiled with the satisfaction of seeing a daughter return home. And Goyath Ka, a gesture that spoke volumes in its simplicity, handed her a rifle that had been cleaned and oiled until it gleamed, a weapon that was both tool and symbol. They rode into the Sierra together, and the town faded behind them like a dream that had never quite been real. The life ahead would not be easy. The Chiricahua faced constant pressure from encroaching settlers and pursuing cavalry. Their traditional lands were shrinking year by year. The old ways were under siege, and no one knew how long they could maintain their freedom. But Ishkay had learned that home was not a place but a belonging, not walls, but bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual respect. She had found her people, not through blood but through choice, and that choice gave her a clarity of purpose she had never known in the world she left behind. The desert stretched before them, harsh and beautiful, a landscape that punished weakness and rewarded strength, a place where survival required adaptation and wisdom. Ishkay had been sold into this world as punishment, meant to die among people her stepfather considered less than human. Instead, she had discovered that humanity was measured not by the color of skin or the language spoken, but by the courage to live according to principles that transcended self-interest. She had found love, not the romantic kind sung about in parlor songs, but the fiercer love of chosen family, of people who would stand beside you when everything else fell away. Years would pass. The Apache Wars would continue, brutal and tragic, ending in reservations and forced marches and the slow starvation of a way of life. But in the high places, in the hidden camps that moved with the seasons, stories would be told of a white woman who chose honor over inheritance, who proved that bridges could be built between worlds, if people had courage enough to cross them. Children would hear of Ishkay, who could track like a Chiricahua, who could read the white man's papers and use their own laws as weapons, who rode beside Goyathle Ka as a trusted companion in the last free days of the Apache nation. The story would become legend, would be embellished and changed by time, but its core truth would remain, that sometimes the people we are meant to find are not the ones who look like us, speak like us, or share our history, but the ones who recognize the truth of who we are and give us space to become who we are meant to be. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The small band continued their journey, becoming silhouettes against the vastness of the land, free in the way that only those who have nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for can be free. Behind them, in the legal offices of Ojo Caliente, documents bearing Ishkay's name ensured that her father's dream would continue, that land would be used wisely, that future generations would benefit from one man's vision of a better world. Ahead of them, the uncertain future called, but they rode toward it together, and that was all that mattered. Every journey changes us, but some journeys reveal who we always were beneath the masks we wore to survive. Ishkay had been many things: daughter, orphan, captive, survivor, truth-teller, and finally, simply herself. The girl who had been bartered away like livestock had transformed into a woman who owned her own story, who determined her own path, who answered to no authority except the code of honor she carried in her heart. The desert had been meant as her grave, but became her liberation. The people meant to be her executioners became her family. And the man who tried to destroy her gave her, unknowingly, the greatest gift of all, the necessity to discover her own strength, the freedom that comes when everything false is burned away and only truth remains. Did you enjoy this journey through the Arizona territory? Tell us which corner of the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story we'll be sharing with you.